All right.
Hey, Dr. Moore, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks so much for joining me today.
I'm glad to. Yeah, sorry it took me a little while to get in here.
That's okay. It's something new. Is this the first time you're doing an Instagram live video?
No, no.
Okay, so
Yeah,
you've done this before. Good.
yeah,
I
yeah,
I always want to ask because I never know like what to expect from the person on the other side, like how comfortable they are. But
yeah,
as long as you're comfortable to go, then I think we'll be good. Um,
yeah.
Thanks for joining me. For
I'm
those
glad to.
who aren't familiar with your work, would you mind just sharing who you are and what you do?
I'm an evangelical writer and preacher, and I serve as president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which helps Christians to apply the gospel to culture and moral decision making.
Right. And you've been very busy these past couple of weeks. When I originally asked you if you wanted to go live, I said we should talk about your newsletter. And I think we will have time to talk about it. But before we do that, I wanted to just talk about some of the other things you've written online with everything going on. Is that okay with you?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. The first article I wanted to talk about was written on January 6th, and this was the gospel in a democracy under assault. I guess an infamous day now. You
Yeah.
wrote, it will take decades to rebuild from the wreckage in this country, but as Christians, we can start now just by not being afraid to say what is objectively the truth. Why don't you give us some background on that article, kind of what was going on? And I also want to know, how are you able to process everything and write an article so quickly?
Well, the article is mostly about the phenomenon that goes on where people speak in different ways than what they actually think. And that's something that is going on all over the place right now, where truth becomes a way to show whose side you're on, rather than being a statement about what is actually there and what is actually going on. And that's what I think is really the fundamental problem here, is that you have people who are saying things that not just aren't believable, but that they don't believe. But it becomes something useful. And I think that's a dangerous place to be. For any society, especially for a Christian. I mean, Jesus tells us, let your yes be yes and your no be no, which means that the inner life needs to line up with the outer. The heart needs to line up with the mouth. And I think that's a problem right now.
Yeah. Um, when you wrote this article, this was there was a lot going on. Why don't you tell me sort of how the events played out from where you were and how you were able to write the article?
Well, I'll take the second part first. It's usually helpful for me to think by writing. So the old, but I think until I've really is true for me. It's how I process things
Yeah,
and work through things. So
I can
that
agree with
was,
that. Yeah.
yeah. And then I was in touch all day with, I mean, obviously, a large part of my staff is right there within blocks away from the Capitol. People that I
Mhm.
love work in the
Mhm.
Capitol. And so there was a great deal of fear and alarm, rightfully so.
Yeah. There was just so much, I think, timeliness to the article. You were able to write it so fast. And I wanted to just really to ask you how are you able to write like that so quickly to get out an article that's timely like that, but also that's I think speaking a lot of truth and pointing to the gospel.
Well, for me, um, I used to tell people this when I was teaching preaching, and they would say, "How do you do it?" And I would say, "Don't do what I do, because everybody just does things differently."
Right,
And
right.
for me, what happens is I have to sort of be thinking and pondering something for a long time, but without knowing that I'm doing it.
Mm.
And then when the adrenaline hits, so, when it comes to preaching, I'll be mulling over the text all week long, but I'm not actually writing out what I'm taking into the pulpit
Mm,
until sometimes Sunday morning.
mm.
It's all there, but it's got to gel together. Otherwise, I have to redo it. And it's a similar thing with writing. The adrenaline has to hit. Well, things that you've been thinking about for a long time, sort of under the surface, then you're able to bring forward.
Well, I do thank you for writing that article. After you wrote that, you actually ended up doing an interview with Colin Hansen for
Yeah.
his podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember listening to that podcast and I was like, oh, great. He stole all my questions that I was going to ask you. So anybody who's listening to this, please go check out Colin Hansen's podcast. It's a great interview that you guys had. There was a part in it where you said, you spent a lot of time talking to young people who love Jesus, but they're about to walk away, and to say you wanted to tell them Jesus is worth following. Don't confuse Jesus with whatever you have seen or experienced around you who claim the name of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to that point? And I work in youth ministry, and so maybe you can give some advice to those who do work with the youth, maybe even on a weekly basis, how we can help with that.
Well, I started in youth ministry, and some of the happiest years of my life were as a youth pastor, and they also were formative for everything else. If you learn how to do youth ministry, you can do everything else because it's the same reality. People don't change as they get older in those respects. So I often tell people the same stuff I was dealing with, who's mad at who because he's sitting next to so and so, whose parents are upset about somebody's form not getting notarized. These are all the issues change, but it's the same psychological and spiritual dynamics at work.
Yes.
And I really, I have this conversation at least once a day
Mm.
with someone who is in a state of deep spiritual crisis about not about the um, not about the cognitive content of Christianity. It's not so.
Mm.
I'm not dealing a lot. I mean, I do sometimes, but not a lot with people who are saying I can't believe that the resurrection happened or that the virgin birth happened or something like that. It's usually people who have seen things within the church or within so-called Christianity that causes. And I really resonate with that because that was the situation I was in when I was 15. And thankfully, even though he was dead, through his writings, C.S. Lewis was able
Mm.
to walk me through that. And so
Mm.
that's sort of the major burden I have in my life. If there's one thing that I want to do, it's that for those
Yeah.
15-year-old kids who, whether they're 15 or 65 or 35 or 25, whatever they are, but in that same situation I was in at 15, and
Mm.
who are sort of watching and thinking, well, does this mean that Christianity is not true, or that Christianity is not for me?
Mm.
Those sorts of things. So if somebody rejects Jesus because they hear Jesus, they understand what it is that he's calling them to, and they say, I don't want to pay that cost. Okay, I'm not happy about that,
Mm.
but it's an even worse tragedy when somebody never actually hears what Jesus is calling, or they don't believe that Jesus is calling them
Mm.
because they've seen some representation of Jesus that isn't true.
That's so good. And also in that same interview, you did mention that that Bible quoting, not Bible reading and Bible shaping, that could be a problem. Uh,
Yeah.
can, how would you recommend those of us who are online, and especially, I guess, for the youth who do spend time online, to combat that problem?
Well, I was quoting from a little book that came out, I think it was last year, called A Concise Guide to the New Testament. Really, really helpful. And that first chapter is where he talked about the difference between Bible quoting and Bible reading. And as soon as I read that, I said, that is exactly what I see happening all the time, where people think they know the Bible, but what they really know is, and it just sort of differs tribe by tribe. So there are some people who know kind of life principles, and they know where to go in the Bible to find those, and they think they know the Bible. Other
Mm,
people who know systematic theology, and really what they know is a kind of systematic theology in terms of answering controversies that they're interested in.
mm,
Calvinism, Arminianism, or egalitarianism, complementarianism, whatever.
mm,
But that's very different from actually reading the Bible and being in the world of the Bible. Which, I mean, what reading does is to take it takes your attention out of even the act of reading, and you become absorbed into it. And so that becomes really hard when there are distractions constantly, or when there's a kind of reading that you can learn from reading online, which is good. I mean, I read things online too, but you can learn a kind of reading there, which is just sort of skimming for major points. That's helpful if you're just reading an article to see, do I care about this?
sure.
But it doesn't work well with reading the Bible.
Mm,
And so just giving yourself the sort of practice and habit of reading the Bible. I mean, I was thinking, there's a friend of mine named Jonathan Rogers who teaches writing, and he puts out this great weekly newsletter on writing called The Habit. And
mm,
he was talking about this story about another guy that he and I both know, who's a musician, and he had a friend who had this encephalitis. He went into the hospital. Well,
okay.
what they would always do when they would see each other is high five. And they kind of had a joke about it where they would do this sort of clap and snap and high five.
Sure.
But the guy, when he had this medical situation, he couldn't remember anything, couldn't
Mm,
remember where he was or anything.
mm,
But the friend, Andy, was sitting in the hospital room. And when his buddy got up to go to the restroom, he just out of instinct high fived him, snapped, and clapped. And
mm,
Jonathan was telling that to make the point, there's so much of our lives that come about through that kind of habit, where
mm,
it's not that you're thinking, I'm learning this so that I will be able to do whatever. It's the habits that you're building in. So most of what is changing you with reading the Bible are things you don't know are changing you. You
mm.
don't know that you need them, and maybe you don't need them now, but you will later on.
And that is so good. That is so good. And I really appreciate the emphasis on reading. This is very important to me and as us as Christians. And so thank you for speaking to that. I have a couple more questions, and then we'll move on to your newsletter. You wrote on January 20th, Inauguration Day in a Time of Crisis and How to Pray. Um, you said that we need to watch the way we pray. Watching how we pray can tell us, like, what do we really think or feel about a situation, and how can we pray for these types of political things that you often speak about when they seem so large and far away from, I guess, from our nitty gritty day to day lives.
Yeah. Well, often they are far away, and I think what you have to do is to ask. Um, you have to ask, where are my specific vulnerabilities, and shore that up in terms of the way that you pray. So if you're the sort of person who's given to kind of political idolatry, then you probably need to spend much less time praying about those things, and
Mm,
move on to praying about your life and your
mm,
immediate context and whatever. And if you're the kind of person who maybe is more vulnerable on the other side to apathy, to giving more attention and time to pray. Just like in the article that you mentioned, one of the things I recommended is to say, because Jesus tells us specifically to pray for your enemies.
mm-hmm.
So I don't think that, political leaders are enemies, at least in our context.
Right, right, right.
Uh, but if we're to pray for enemies, we certainly are to pray for those who uh, disagree with us. And
Mm,
so
mm,
what I,
mm,
what I recommended is if you're the kind of person who is a supporter of President Biden, maybe focus your prayers on your ability to see where President Biden might be wrong and to be
Mm,
willing to stand on that, and for others who are
mm,
supporters to do that. And if you're somebody who's an opponent of President Biden, you don't like him, you didn't vote for him, then you spend your time praying more for President Biden to be successful in every good thing,
mm,
and to have wisdom and discernment, as opposed to, I think sometimes, and this happens wherever somebody is politically, there's almost a disappointment if the person does the right thing.
You wrote him on that. You wrote on that.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
and I've seen that happen with, there was a situation where I was working with somebody who was actually changing his mind on
Mm.
an issue that really mattered. And someone else in the coalition said, "Oh, well, we don't want that to happen because he's one of our opponents." I said, "Well, not if he changes his mind,
Right.
that he's one of our
You're
allies by
gonna win him
definition."
over.
Yeah, but that's not the way that the thinking went, and that's not the way that the thinking often goes in American life. Or
Mm,
even, I mean,
mm.
it's not just with the big sort of presidential level. That's often the case just in interpersonal relationships,
Right.
you
Uh,
know?
doc- Dr. Moore, I'm so thankful that you're able to talk on reading and praying. These are all very important things, and it's obvious to me that you have a lot of wisdom, expertise in these areas, and other people have picked up on that too. You were recently profiled, featured by Time Magazine. Um, I'm assuming you saw this profile and you read it.
I haven't read it, but
Oh, okay.
I don't ever read those things, but
Oh,
I know it's out there, but I haven't read it.
I was going to ask you how you felt about it. I was going to ask you how you felt about it or how you felt about just being profiled there.
I
But
don't
if you haven't
ever
read it,
I don't ever read those things at all.
that's
And
wisdom right there.
well, I think for some people it might be a good thing to do. For me, it's just not helpful, because what I will do, just the way how flawed I am as a person, what
Mm.
I'll do is sort of focus on something that someone got wrong. Not saying that
Mm.
there's anything wrong in that piece,
Sure.
but
Right.
sometimes somebody will have something wrong, or they'll word something wrong, and I'll sort of dwell on that in ways that aren't helpful. So I don't ever do it.
No, I appreciate that, and what should I clarify is that there's wisdom in you not reading that. That seems like a smart thing to do, and something that maybe I should consider in my own life. I don't always need to know what everybody's saying about me all the
Oh
time.
yeah. Oh yeah, that's exactly right. You really can't, because if you do, if you it's almost, there's a leadership expert that I always
Mm.
listen to, Seth Godin,
Yeah.
who talks about, while you're creating something, maybe it's
Hmm.
a youth Bible study that you're doing
Hmm.
for a
Hmm.
Wednesday night, if you're spending that time sort of thinking about what people are going to say about it, you're actually not even going to be able to produce something
All right.
for people. And so I think that's true.
Dr. Moore, you've been really productive these last several weeks, and it shows. I want to talk about the 2021 legislative agenda for the ERLC, if you want to just touch on that. And then I want to talk about your newsletter. I want you to tell me all about your newsletter. This is something I look forward to every week.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, the legislative agenda is just sort of an outline and a skeleton of some things that we're going to be concerned about over the next year. It's not exhaustive, because there are a lot of things you just don't know what's going to happen in any year. I certainly would not have known in December of 2019 that we would have a global pandemic and
Right.
murder hornets, and you fill in the
Yeah.
rest, for 2020. So that was that. The newsletter is meant just to sort of be a first draft of things that I'm interested in at the time. And it it sort of is one step after I started doing this practice that is in the artist's journey, because someone had recommended this. And what it is just to get up and just start writing 3 pages in the morning. But it has to be 3 pages that you're not going to show to anybody and that you're not even going to read yourself. And I just found it was really helpful for me to, I didn't know really what was on my mind until I started doing that. And I could kind of, because you just sit down and you just start writing about whatever you're thinking about.
Right.
And so I wanted to have sort of a middle stage between that and, the formal things that I write, just to say
Right.
this is a conversation, and I'm kind of wanting you to be with me at the first step, or
Right.
maybe the
Right.
second step as I'm thinking
Yeah.
through something.
I mean, do you see it as, I guess, officially part of your body of work? I guess, like if we were going to have a comprehensive collection of all of your writing, would those newsletters be included?
I don't know. I don't know, but uh, they're helpful to me for a number of reasons, and one of those things is to I hear from people who are readers of the newsletter every week, and that's really helpful to me to sort of get a read on what people are dealing with, sort of things that are going on in their lives. Sometimes I can tell when there's a lot of sort of people writing in on a specific subject,
Mm.
and especially if there's a lot of um, emotional investment in whatever that subject. I mean, for instance, this week I had a little section talking about families that are in conflict over the election and politics
Right.
and whatever, and
Right.
heard from a lot of people
Oh,
who
okay.
are
Okay.
going through that.
Yeah.
And that just helps me to know, okay, I need to be paying more attention to that in people's
Yeah.
lives.
That it was something I actually wanted to ask you about. It was a reader question that
Yeah,
you
it
were
was.
answering. So
Hmm.
you do take reader questions in your newsletters, which I
I
think
do.
are part of the fun areas that I like to read about. And it was what to do if a family split over politics.
Yeah.
Um, I want to ask you about that. Do you think politics will continue to impact our lives in this way, where it's so divisive like this? And also for you personally, how do you keep going and being motivated to work in this, I guess I want to say climate?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that I don't pay a lot of attention to the climate. I'm aware of the climate and trying to speak into the climate, but I'm trying to be um, in it a little bit, but not of it.
Mm, mm.
And I think that takes um, almost a willingness to go in and then come out.
Right,
You
right,
know,
right. Yeah.
which I think is what Jesus teaches us to do by
Mm,
example. I mean, he
mm, mm.
engages, withdraws, engages, withdraws.
Right, right.
And I think that's an important principle of it. I do think that it's going to continue to be divisive for a couple of reasons. One, because it's been made a religion slash spectator sport.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So people, when they're dealing with politics, they aren't really talking about politics. It's not, here are a set of issues that I believe in. It's instead, this is my identity as part of this hive. And it's
Right,
even not
right.
even that. It's this is my identity as not part of that hive.
Yeah.
And so I think there's what Paul called an unhealthy craving for controversy that's
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
behind that. And if it's not politics, it'll move to something else. But the same dynamic will be there because you've sort of got a perfect storm of a loss of religious identity combined with social media, where people they feel like they have to commit themselves wholeheartedly to personalities or to tribes in such a way that they're then committed to that, and it becomes this sort of video game that goes on.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be the case for a while, but I'm hopeful that there's a limit to it because it's ultimately exhausting.
Yes.
You
Yes.
can't live a life. I mean, it's not a happy life for someone. And so
Mm.
there comes an exhaustion point, and the question is, what happens after the exhaustion point?
Mm.
And I've seen
And
that in the lives of a lot of people. I've
mhm.
seen some people that were my students years ago that I would have thought these guys are never going to make it in ministry because they're just always in the, trying to be in the middle of some controversy.
Mm.
And, some of those people did end up becoming that kind of person, but most
Mm.
of them matured out of it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you would never know that that
Mm.
was the case.
You talked a little bit, or you spoke to it about that mob mentality, and that was actually like the main meat of your most recent newsletter.
Yeah.
And your title was "Walk Away from the Mob." Um, you wrote that sometimes the mob to which one is drawn is a social media hive or a schoolyard of bullies tormenting a student who doesn't fit in there. Sometimes it can be a religious body seeking to shame a victim of abuse or to silence one who speaks for her. But I do want to speak about that social media hive, which you kind of mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that impacting Christian churches' ministries on the internet? And what should we do, therefore, to work against that, if we can at all?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is to model something else. I mean, I think that's important. You don't have to be in the middle of every controversy. And actually, it's sort of the same advice that I give to people who are thinking whether they should run for public office, is to say the people who least want to be in public office should be those who are doing it. And the
Mm,
people who really want to be in public office should be the people who don't.
mm, mm,
I think it's healthier that way. And the same thing is the case when it comes to controversy. The people who engage in controversy have to be the people who don't love controversy.
mm.
The same way you want a general leading you into war who doesn't love war.
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of it. And just modeling that, but then also, I mean, I talk to pastors all the time and other ministry leaders who are, as one pastor said to me, I look at what my people post on Facebook and I think I'm a failure. And I
Mm,
said, well, no, you're not a failure because, I mean, uh, you just are able to see sort of all this stuff in a way that you wouldn't have been able to see it in some other
mhm.
generation of
Right.
the church. But
Right.
also to say you really can't change that immediately.
Mhm,
That's
mhm,
something that's got to change over a long period of time of sanctification.
mm,
And I think just having people to know that they can step away from some aspects of social media is, or even just to choose a form of social media that doesn't appeal to their worst um, aspects. So for me,
right.
for instance, um, Twitter is
Mhm,
depressing to me. I mean,
mm.
I don't read things about me on Twitter, but it's depressing just because I see people acting in ways that I don't really want to know.
Right.
It's more helpful for me to love them if I
Yes.
don't see that part of them.
Yeah.
But Instagram is not a problem for me. It is a problem for some people. If some people have their vulnerability is they tend to get envious.
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
Well, then maybe you shouldn't be on Instagram, and maybe
mhm.
you should be on Twitter instead. So you just have to kind of know where your weak points are.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate you coming on Instagram to talk about Instagram. This is
I
a,
like Instagram. I actually think
yeah.
Instagram is it's my favorite of the medium.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. I find it highly enjoyable, and one reason why is because I get to do stuff like this, where I get to get
Yeah.
connected with some of my favorite authors. You wrote one more section, actually two more sections in your email. One was concerning baby names, and you were talking about how um, I don't want to talk about the baby names in particular. I just thought it was interesting how you find these things. Do you just surf and you find these things that stand out to you? Does somebody on your team bring them to you to speak
No,
to?
I just am interested in a lot of things and read widely. So it's just stuff that is interesting to me. Nobody brings anything to me. It's just stuff that it's just stuff that I may think about at some point during the week. I don't I write the newsletter out all at once on Sunday afternoon.
Oh, okay, okay.
So I don't write it out piece by piece, and I don't really think about it during the week,
Mm, mm,
other
mm.
than to something will catch my attention,
Right.
and I would like to think about that a little bit more.
Mm. The other part of your newsletter that I wanted to talk about was your desert island bookshelf.
Yeah.
And this is a staple of your newsletter that's
Hmm.
always there. Um, how does what we read and listen to, because you also include like what music you're listening to or different podcasts, I
Yeah.
suppose. What does that tell you about a person? I want to know why you include that in your newsletter, basically. Like, why are you fascinated with this, what people are reading?
Well, with the Desert Island bookshelf, it's not so much what people are reading as
Mm,
much as what it is that they feel they would need.
good point. Good point.
So it's about if you could only have one shelf of books that are with you for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
Right.
And I think that sort of helps me to know people, but it also helps me to sort of think that through because there will often be things that people will write about in Desert Island Bookshelf, where what I will do is to think back on, yeah, I mean, uh, I can see how God has been gracious to me. Sometimes not even in things that they're reading, but for instance, a woman who wrote in this past week had said, I would have books on canning and gardening. She said, I like to can and garden, but I'm not a crazy prepper.
Right. Right.
And I thought, well, I would have never thought that you were a crazy prepper because what I thought about is growing up next door to a grandmother who was always gardening, and I was working with her in the garden and canning. And that just gave me a reminder of that's one way that God has been gracious to me. So I think
Mm.
it helps you to reflect on that.
Well, I do appreciate your entire newsletter.
Thank you.
You can subscribe to it at russellmore.com. I think there's a link on your website,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's called More to the Point, and typically you bring it out every Monday.
Monday.
So, Dr. Moore, thank you so much for writing that. And for
Thank
all the
you.
other articles we mentioned on the internet, all the other podcasts and interviews I hear you doing, it's very helpful for me to think through everything that's going on in the world. Thank you so much for
Well,
your work.
that's kind. Thank you. And blessings on your ministry.
Oh, thanks so much. Before you go, I
Mhm.
do want to mention that I do, I, this your book Adopted for Life. This book literally changed my life, and
Oh,
I've mentioned this before. My wife and I adopted our first son almost 2 years ago, and so Dr. Moore, thank you for pointing to just the beauty of adoption and the gospel, and showing me more of Jesus through your writing. I continue to
oh,
learn
well,
from
that's
you. Thank you
kind.
so much.
How's your son doing?
He's good. He's good. He should be napping right now, so I'm going to go check on him. We're gonna go, and I'll tell him all about this.
Okay. Well, so good to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Dr. Moore. I'll see you later
All
online.
right.
I'm on Instagram, I guess.
Okay. All right. Take care.
Bye bye. Bye bye.